we're going to talk about all things boundaries. This is something that I have gotten a million requests for. Okay, so I've gotten so many requests behind the scenes for people that have said, hey, can you talk about boundaries? I want to set them. I want to be good at them. I want to know what to set, what kind of boundaries there are. How do I know that they're good? How do I follow through? Like, I've gotten all sorts of cool questions about this. So this is what we're going to talk about today. The perspective I obviously take is one of a systems-oriented therapist, which basically means that I have studied how systems work, systems having inherent boundaries that are just in them, because that's just part of a system, is having boundaries. And so navigating boundaries and setting boundaries is a really important part of my work as a therapist, and it's an important part of all of our lives. And oftentimes it's really hard for us to figure out how to set them or what to say to other people, how to communicate those boundaries, what happens if people violate our boundaries, all sorts of stuff like that. So I'm going to be using a combination of what I've learned, and I'm also going to be using a combination of what I've learned and just in my practice as a therapist who works with relationships and works with family systems, of things that I've seen are effective, things that I help encourage people to do, that kind of thing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give a quick rundown as we go through this about the different types of boundaries that there are, which may be helpful just to have them listed out. And then we're going to talk about what types of boundaries exist, like how those boundaries manifest themselves, which ones are healthy, which ones aren't, what are the consequences of different types of boundaries. And then we're going to get into talking about how to communicate them and how to set them and follow through. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about here, this is adapted from a lecture that I do. It's a graduate level class on the models of family therapy. And there's one model that's called structural family therapy that is really focused on boundaries and hierarchy. We have to take into account anytime we're talking about boundaries as having power involved, right? Do you have power to set boundaries? Do you have power to not adhere to somebody's boundaries? That type of thing. So power is inherent within this. So, okay, the first thing that boundaries do is they protect us, okay? So what do our boundaries protect? Now, you all probably have a felt sense of this in your own lives, okay? But sometimes I think it's helpful to have some of this stuff be explicit. So what do boundaries protect? Boundaries protect our time, our emotional state. They protect our energy, and they protect our values. Time is something that is obviously a valuable asset for all of us. And so we want to be able to set healthy boundaries in such a way that our time is protected, so that you're able to use time in such a way that you can get things done that you need to get done, that you can have fun, that you can just allocate your time in such a way that's important. Time is an area that people tend to have very poor boundaries around, because we run out of it very quickly. And people overextend themselves, and all of a sudden they find themselves not even necessarily overwhelmed by the tasks that they have and the things that they've committed to, but rather by the time that they don't have, that they need to have in order to be able to do something. So time is something that we want to be thinking about when we are thinking about boundaries that we want to set with somebody. Our emotional state. So in order for you to be able to take care of other people, in order for you to be able to take care of yourself, in order for you to be able to engage in any kind of healthy self-talk, and also in any, like, your ability to behave in a certain way that you want to behave or interact in a way that you want to behave, we have to think about how we set boundaries to both protect our emotional state, but also facilitate a healthy immersion in our emotional state. So this doesn't mean setting boundaries that make it so that you feel good all the time. Sometimes we actually, like when I'm working with anxiety, for example, sometimes we have to self-impose boundaries that make it so that we have to hang in there with a distressing emotional state so that we can build a degree of distress tolerance around that. Okay, so emotional state does not mean we are setting boundaries to make it so that we feel good all the time. At the same time, we do want to set boundaries with others in such a way that they facilitate an emotional state that we consider to be healthy. So boundaries with ourselves are important, but also boundaries with others. So how do we allow people to talk to us? How do we allow people to use language to either hurt or help us? Basically, what is the structure under which a person is allowed to have a relationship with you and maintain a level of interaction with you? So that's the next part. The other thing that we're thinking about protecting when we're setting boundaries is our energy. So if you don't set good boundaries, if you don't think about your boundaries, if you're just kind of shooting from the hip, you are likely going to run out of energy. Whether that's energy that allows you to function at work, at home, in relationships, with yourself, in self-care activities. So if you find yourself having energy sucked out of you in different areas, you may think about the ways in which you can set some boundaries to protect yourself. Now, I'm talking about boundaries in a very individualistic sense, but I do think it's important to realize that there's a clash of boundaries at times, particularly in intimate relationships, that we have to navigate and figure out. Okay, and then we also want to set boundaries around our values. So what's important to you? What's something that you need? Do you need to have time? Like, I need to have time to play video games. I need to have time for my relationship. I need to have time to build the stream and take care of that. See my clients. Okay, I value having a good work-life balance, and so I have to be very clear and about my boundaries and understand what they are. If you're thinking about a boundary that you're wanting to set, or like if you find yourself in this space where you're like, God, you know, I feel like I'm worn thin. I feel like I either don't have enough time, my emotional state is really sucks because I'm not present in the ways that I want to be. I don't have a lot of energy, or my values seem to be at stake. That's a cue that we may need to think about what boundaries currently exist and how they might be adjusted. An important thing to remember about boundaries at any given time is that you always have boundaries. There's really no such thing as no boundaries, which is what's going to bring me to the next part of this. Again, I'm just laying a foundation here. We'll get into more like specifics and stuff here in a second. So there are 3 types of boundaries, and when I'm a therapist and I'm mapping out somebody's family system, I'm going to be thinking about how I map their system using these 3 types of boundaries. The first type of boundary that you may see is drawn this way is what we call a rigid boundary. Rigid boundaries are boundaries that are very clear and often are not negotiable. So think about this for a second in your own lives. Whatever context you want to think about. If you want to think about it in your relationship, if you want to think about it at work, if you want to think about it with your family of origin.
You never give up, do you?
Whatever it may be. Again, very clearly defined, but they're mostly immovable. So if you think about whatever context you want to think about it in, think about what are your deal breakers. That's another way to think about it. Okay, so a rigid boundary that I have in my own life, as an example, is video games are part of my life. I will not compromise being able to play video games in my life. So like when I was trying to figure out who to be in a relationship with, I couldn't be in an intimate relationship with a person who puts rigid boundaries around my video game use or says I can't play video games. Like, that's just not cool. Not into it. Think about in your life where you have rigid boundaries. These are not necessarily bad. Sometimes we need to have rigid boundaries, and sometimes not having rigid boundaries causes problems for us. But some would make the argument, like from a structural therapy standpoint, there's often the argument made that rigid boundaries are never useful because it lends itself to a lack of negotiation and a lack of flexibility, and that is true. However, sometimes we have to think about either where we have rigid boundaries placed or where we would like to place them, and then to know what the consequences of that are. And so the consequences of rigid boundaries oftentimes are disengagement, especially from a relationship standpoint. So if you're wanting to create distance in your relationships, then one of the things that you're going to be thinking about is a rigid boundary. Again, rigid boundaries are clear, defined, non-flexible boundaries, often seen as being ultimatums or just a very clear statement of, no, I won't do it. The next type of boundary that we're going to talk about is what's called a diffuse boundary. So diffuse boundaries are oftentimes looked at as being a lack of boundaries. And so if there isn't a boundary, it generally means it's because there's a diffuse boundary. So, and I think it's really important for everybody to understand, you always have boundaries. Diffuse boundaries are where you basically let anything in. Sometimes it's seen as like going with the flow or going with somebody else or overextending yourself. And what happens when we have a lot of diffuse boundaries, particularly with people or even work, is what's called enmeshment. Porous boundaries, yes, you could say that as a thesaurus, K-girl, absolutely. And what enmeshment is basically where, so if I didn't have any boundaries, say within my friend group and my relationship, and somebody asked me, how am I feeling? And I maybe looked at Allie and said, I don't know, how am I feeling? Or my emotional state is completely relative to somebody else. That's a diffuse boundary. That's basically my inability to see myself as autonomous. It's like I'm only integrated within the system. All right, so an example of a diffuse boundary with time is I told you guys at the very beginning of this segment when I started talking about boundaries, what did I say to you about a time boundary? Anybody remember? 8 o'clock, right? Okay, so you guys know now that I'm going to go offline at 8 o'clock. And I said that to you very clearly up front. I have a hard stop at 8 o'clock. And so if I had diffuse boundaries around my time, what might happen is, let's say you guys are all chatting up really well. You guys are really involved and we're going and it's great. And Allie comes home and we're going, and then we get to 8 o'clock and I just blow past that. And I go to like 9 o'clock or I go to 10 o'clock and I'm super tired and I don't really want to be doing this, but you guys are chatting with me and I just keep pushing my time limit. That would be an example of potentially a diffuse boundary around time. A diffuse boundary around energy may be that I might have relationship demands or family demands that are really tiring for me, but I still go to family engagements or I still answer the phone when a family member calls, even if I don't want to, because I have diffuse boundaries in that way. Diffuse boundaries around values. If you're a person who is very deferential, and somebody says, well, Dr. Mick, how do you feel about this? And I keep going like, well, I don't know. how do you feel about it? Or, I'd have to check with my family on how they feel about it. That could very well mean that you've got diffuse boundaries around certain values. You said, Dr. Mick, where do you fall on whether people should be vaccinated or not? And I said, I don't know. What do you think? You tell me. Or I went over and looked at Allie and said, like, Allie, how do I feel about vaccinations? It could be a diffuse boundary around values. Hope that makes sense. Diffuse and rigid boundaries happen when we don't think about them, generally. If somebody else's emotional state is defining your emotional state, it probably means diffuse. So let's say, for example, that when Allie comes home, let's say that Allie has a bad day and she's really pissed off when she gets home, and then I all of a sudden get really pissed off and I'm in a bad mood and I'm angry. It could mean that her and I have some diffuse boundaries around our emotional state where basically we absorb each other's emotional state. And all of a sudden I'm angry and not thinking about my own emotional state relative to hers. I'm just angry now, and now we're both angry. There's a third boundary that I haven't talked about yet that is an important one for me to get into so that we can actually get into talking about differences. So, because you're going to see here in a minute that rigid boundaries and diffuse boundaries are often the product of not having clear boundaries. Because clear boundaries are what allow us to be flexible. But flexible on our terms. So one way that you may know that you tend to have diffuse boundaries with people is if you become overly flexible in a way that doesn't feel like it's on your terms. Then all of a sudden, you may be moving towards diffuse. Conversely, if you are only operating on your terms solely, and it's the, say for example, it's the M- show, or it's the Gerbo show, or the K-Girl show, then we're moving toward rigid boundaries. It's tough because we're always regulating. But the thing about having clear boundaries is that clear boundaries need to be communicated, and boundaries don't become clear until they become overtly stated. And what these clear boundaries do is they allow for some flexibility relative to context, relative to what the situation is calling for. So again, for example, if let's say I say, I don't talk about my feelings. You might say, okay, well that's a very clear boundary, Ryan. Like, that was clear. You just said you won't talk about your feelings. Well, let's say I get into an intimate relationship where all of a sudden that context gets to a point where it calls for me to speak to my emotional experience and put words to my emotional experience. Well, if I say I don't talk about my feelings and the relationship is calling for that, I am now skewing toward a rigid boundary because I'm not allowing for flexibility in a context that may demand for me to be a little bit more flexible with that. Not that I have to pour my heart and soul out in the relationship, but that I do need to talk about how I feel sometimes. Because it may be that my inability to talk about my feelings, or my unwillingness to, is now spilling over in other ways, because we can't not feel. It just comes out in different ways. Where maybe I come home from work and I put another rigid boundary up with my significant other where I completely shut them out. And I say, and I don't talk to them. Like, I come home and I sit at my computer and I just don't even engage with my significant other. That's a rigid boundary now that's been set, compounded by a rigid boundary that I'm setting around my talking about my emotional experience. So a clear boundary, you could say like something along the lines, yeah, Tally, of I don't like to talk about my feelings, or I'm not going to talk about my feelings here because let's say, for example, you're in a business meeting and it's calling for you to negotiate something or you have to be as neutral as you can be. In that case, having a very clear boundary about I'm not going to talk about my feelings may be useful, but it's all about, again, being clear about where you stand on something. Now, if you say, I never talk about my feelings, and then somebody comes up to you and says, well, how are you doing? And then you just unload, that could be diffuse. Let's say also you go on a first date where there probably needs to be some level of boundaries there around sharing your emotional experience, potentially, or you know what you want them to be. And then you get into that date and then you start spilling how you feel about the fact that you just got out of a bad relationship. You may be setting a very diffuse boundary around emotional expression with that person in a way that's not, maybe your clear boundary is I will talk about my feelings, but it's misplaced in this context, okay? So context matters so much for all of this. But the most important part about this is that there's flexibility in your boundaries. What if you want to talk about your feelings, but the other in the relationship does not want to, and then you start to shut them out? Okay, so that's a beautiful example. By the way, Thad, I appreciate you. First of all, I appreciate the follow and also that you're chatting. So Thad, that's a really interesting question. So you want to talk about your feelings. Let's say there's a very clear, talking about my feelings is important to me in a relationship. That would constitute a value boundary, okay? You go to talk to this person about your feelings. That person puts up a rigid boundary because maybe they're saying, maybe for whatever their reason is, we don't know what that is. You start to shut them out means that you're then moving toward a rigid boundary of now I'm going to disengage because you've set a rigid boundary, I'm going to set a rigid boundary, and now we're both disengaged. And so the important piece there would maybe need to be, Thad, that you say, well, it's really important for me to be able to talk about my emotional experience. That person says, well, it's important for me too, but I'm not ready. So can we engage in some problem solving around how we navigate that? I'm not necessarily ready for that yet, but I would like to. People do this with sex all the time in relationships when they first start, right? Like, I'm not ready to have sex yet. It's a thing that's important to me, but I don't want to do it yet. And another person says, well, I'm ready for sex, but because you need consent, you can't act on it, right? So we have to kind of have these boundaries, but clearly stated of, no, I'm not interested in sex right now, or I'm not interested in sharing how I feel right now. So again, these are our boundaries. They are designed to protect these 4 things. What we're going for, if we can, as best as possible, are clear and flexible boundaries. We want to be able to be flexible, but we want the flexibility to be, as much as it can be, on our terms. So while we're protecting these things, what are the types of boundaries that we set? Well, I'm so glad that you asked, because we're going to talk about those. Is there a situation where it's okay to get more assertive than normal in a professional setting to maintain a boundary? If so, how would you go about it? Well, sure. You just have to be able to evaluate what the consequences of that boundary are, Zach. And so if I want to assert and maintain this boundary, there are always consequences to our boundaries. There's always a relational impact when we set a boundary, whether it's at work, whether it's at family, whatever it is. So if I have a boundary, say as a teacher, that says, I will not compromise my role as a gatekeeper. Like, I think it's important for me to evaluate students based on the work they do. And then a work context says, well, no, let it slide. Like, let it go. We need to make sure that the students make it through the program. So just let it slide. Don't follow through with that value boundary that you have. I have to make a decision at that point of whether I want to double down on that boundary and make it a little bit more rigid, or do I want to stay flexible? Do I want to say, well, okay, I can work with that, but I'm going to need to have a remediation plan with these students because this is a value boundary that is very important to me. Or do I say, you know what? No, that's not okay. And then what's potentially the consequence of that? Is there fallout from it? Or you look down on? And then it may lead to a point where you have to say, you know what? Then I can't teach here. If you're going to force me to go beyond that boundary, I got to put a rigid boundary and disengage, because that's what's healthy for me, because I've tried to work with you around this value boundary that I have, and that's just not going to work. That's a case in which the rigid boundary becomes healthy. So does that make sense, Zach? Kind of how that works? We always have to be aware of what are the potential consequences, right? Potential consequence of me having a more rigid boundary is potential disengagement. If I open up and become diffuse in my boundary, there's potential enmeshment with the system where maybe my value becomes compromised, because now I'm just operating off of the system's value, and I have not been able to see my values as being autonomous but also shared by a given system. We tend to thrive in systems where we feel like we have a level of autonomy and we can recognize our own values and boundaries, but also can be seen as part of the system's values, and that there's some overlap there, but also autonomy for each. Like, I don't have to agree with every single thing that goes on with my employer, but there should hopefully be a level of alignment there that setting clear boundaries is easy to do and people are amicable to that. A lot of times people get frustrated with managers who have incredibly rigid boundaries and aren't willing to work with them, or a system that has incredibly rigid boundaries. Diffuse boundaries tend to be systems that are incredibly reactive. So if you think about your own families or your own like current systems that you operate within, if you are in a system that tends to be highly emotionally reactive and intense, there is likelihood that the boundaries skew towards diffuse, where everybody's just building off of each other and there's an intensity and nobody's really asserting themselves and it's just chaos, right? That's technically a sign of enmeshed boundaries. On the other hand, if you are in a system that tends to be very cold and is not particularly expressive and is to the point and just matter of fact, that can oftentimes be a reflection of rigid bounds within a system. Maybe it'll be helpful for me to talk to you guys a little bit about what some common examples of these types of boundaries are, so that you can think about in your own life, how are your own boundaries manifesting. By the way, it's important to recognize what your current boundaries are before you start configuring them into something new. Here's an example of rigid boundaries. So if you are a person who avoids, this is talking mostly in intimate relationships, but in general, okay? If you avoid intimacy, whatever that may mean for you, this doesn't have to necessarily be in a sexual relationship or something like that, but if you tend to avoid intimacy, if you don't want to get too close to people, rigid boundaries often are like that avoidance. So avoiding closeness is probably the better one, but like maybe I don't share. I stay quiet. I don't go to gatherings. I don't self-disclose much. Another example is if you're unlikely to ask for help. So if you are in distress and you need help and you won't ask for it, that is often a rigid boundary. If you have very few close relationships, that can be the product of rigid boundaries. Again, disengagement. It's hard to maintain disengaged relationships. Like if you're setting up really rigid boundaries at all times and not letting people in and putting up walls and being rigid even in your conversations, it's going to be hard to have close relationships because you're going to feel a sense of disengagement. That should make sense inherently, okay? So if you find yourself, again, as a person, if you find yourself struggling to form close relationships, it may be related to rigid boundaries that you're setting or that others are setting with you, okay? Another example, if you are highly protective of yourself and your information, that could be a healthy boundary, okay? If you're not wanting to put your information out there, if you're not wanting to self-disclose, maybe you have bad experiences with that in your life. But again, being protective of your information is generally a sign that you are setting up some degree of rigid boundary. Detachment is another example of rigid boundaries. And this will probably hit home for some of you. Avoidance of rejection. So, rejection is generally the result of a rigid boundary that is put upon us. And so an avoidance of rejection is a reactionary, or I guess proactive, rigid boundary that we might set to keep things at a distance so that we are not rejected. So rigid boundaries can sometimes be in relation to worrying about other rigid boundaries. Fear of abandonment would be an example of that for sure. Abandonment, by the way, is the setting of a rigid boundary because a person is disengaging fully. Cutting somebody off is a rigid boundary. Again, you can't not have boundaries. Remember that. So if you avoid intimacy, if you don't ask for help, if you have few close relationships, if you're highly protective. Another example of rigid boundaries that I've seen frequently is dominance. So I assert myself big time into spaces, and I set very clear boundaries by dominating so that other people cannot get in. That's another example of a rigid boundary that you may put up and may lead to disengagement because it'll push people away more often than not. I know, I'm sure that this is probably speaking to many of you on a very visceral level right now. But that's why we talk about this, okay? Because it's important to be able to recognize this stuff. Like if you see this, it doesn't necessarily, I want to be very clear. If you are engaged, if this speaks to you, if this list is like, oh my God, this is my soul, it does not mean you're a bad person. It just means that you're a person who tends to operate with rigid boundaries. And that can be because you learned you had to do that. It could be because you had to. It could be because that's how you survived. So we don't immediately, like as a therapist, I don't immediately go in and say, wow, you're putting up rigid boundaries and that's bad. The first thing you do when you see boundaries is be curious about them. And this really goes to all of you too. If you notice that people are setting really rigid boundaries, as best you can, you may consider being curious about where those boundaries are coming from. Because there are reasons we set the boundaries that we set. Are you protecting something? That's generally, again, what it is. That's what boundaries do. When you build a house, it's to protect you from the outside. When you spray off on your body, it's to protect you from mosquitoes. When we put up barriers, it's to make sure that we are safe. You put a moat around a castle, it's to make sure people can't get into the castle. But there comes a point sometimes where if we put too many barriers up, it starts to do damage. So you gotta know what your boundaries are before you think about how you want to change them. So if there's a rigid boundary regarding avoidance of rejection, that can cause a lot of diffuse boundaries elsewhere, right? Effectively becoming a people pleaser. Yes, beautiful staircase. Yes, it can. Yes, it can. That would actually be, though, an example of diffuse boundaries, because if you're like, well, that's the intertwining of it to some extent. Like sometimes you can go either way on these. Diffuse and rigid sit together very frequently. So an abusive childhood caused these types of stonewall rigid boundaries. It could, if that's how you were able to protect yourself. You know, if you had to go in your room and shut your door and turn and blast music so that you didn't have to hear your parents yelling, that was you putting up some rigid boundaries around seeing anxiety and seeing conflict. And so then if you become a conflict averse person where you set up these really rigid boundaries that like, I'm not going to touch conflict, that very well could be the case. These are examples, again, of what rigid boundaries, how they can manifest themselves. There's many ways that this can happen. This is not the end all be all list. This is just for the purposes of me teaching you guys a little bit about what I'm thinking about as a therapist when I'm working with relationships. Rigid boundaries often put distance between people and stuff or other people. That's their purpose. Now, on the other hand, diffuse boundaries. What happens with this? Okay? So, if you are a person that overshares personal info, That could be an example of diffuse boundaries. Basically, just getting it all out there. Making sure everybody knows everything about you. Now that could push people away, but it could also draw some people in. But it also may mean that you are dumping all of your personal info to see how the person responds, to see if they are accepting of you. So if you overshare personal info, there you go. That's one example. If you have difficulty saying no, that is often a sign of diffuse boundaries. If you won't, because if you say yes to everything, yes is inherently an invitation. No is a barrier. Yes is not. So yes is pulling people in. And if you struggle to say no, even when you want to, it may be that you're operating on a level of diffuse boundary. If you are over involved in other people's issues, if you're a person who's just constantly trying to eat up drama, if you're a person who will take care of others before you would ever even consider taking care of yourself, if you will forego your own values, your own time, your own emotional state to take care of another person's emotional state, it's a real good chance you've got diffuse boundaries. The nastiest version of this is a resentful martyr. I don't know if any of you know what a resentful martyr is, but basically a resentful martyr is somebody who will over-involve themselves in other people's issues and then become resentful to those people for the fact that they are involved in those issues. And those types of people are incredibly challenging. I struggle with resentful martyrs a lot because a lot of times what people will say is, I didn't ask you to get involved in this. I didn't want you to be a part of this, and you inserted yourself, and now you're making me feel bad about it? Are you kidding me? And that's a product, again, of diffuse boundaries, trying to put diffuse boundaries onto people. All right, so over-involved in other people's issues, diffuse, especially at the expense of yourself. Okay. So if you are dependent upon others' opinions, that can also be a product of diffuse boundaries. If you find it really hard to assert yourself, or to form an opinion, or to share an opinion, or if you're easily influenced by other people's opinions and what they tell you to do, it could very well be that you have some diffuse boundaries. So if you're a very impressionable person, there's a good chance that it's because you haven't formed up some boundaries around your values. You can see as I'm talking about these how they get tied back into those protectors, or the things that were being protected that we talked about, that we talked about a while back. Now, hold on a second before you get riled up with what I just wrote. If you're a person who's accepting of abuse or disrespect, that is an example of a diffuse boundary, but that, like when we talked about with rigid boundaries, could be a survival strategy. So do not take this to mean that accepting of abuse, that I'm victim blaming, because that's not at all what I'm doing. I'm not saying you're an awful person if you have diffuse boundaries, if you accept disrespect. What I'm saying is that is a diffuse boundary, and it was likely learned that I need to accept this, and I just have to take it, because if I become rigid or clear in this moment, I could potentially be harmed. However, if you're a person who, in daily life, say a person talks shit about you, or a person says something badly about you, and you just kind of take it because you're conflict averse in that way, or even worse, if you believe it, just without any precursor or any context, if you're a person who's just like, oh my God, like somebody, so like if somebody on Twitter said, Dr. Mick's an idiot and he doesn't know what he's talking about with boundaries. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm a bad person and I don't know what I'm talking about with boundaries. Could be that I'm diffuse in my boundaries with the Twitter sphere. Fear of rejection if you don't comply. So if you're worried that, and this is what we were talking about earlier, I forget who it was that was saying it, but if you have this fear that you will be isolated or rejected if you don't conform to whatever the system or other person needs or is saying they want, then it could be that you're a person who has diffuse boundaries. You may overextend yourself. Is it possible to flip-flop between rigid and diffuse boundaries, trying to compensate one for the other? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's not like you're a person who only sets rigid boundaries or only sets diffuse boundaries. We have rigid and diffuse boundaries all over the place. So yes, they can play off of each other. Sometimes people with really diffuse boundaries will elicit really rigid boundaries out of others, and vice versa. You could see how relationally these things can. And finally, this is one that it may hit home for a lot of you, but this is one that I see a lot. Is if you engage in a significant amount of reassurance seeking from others, that is often a sign of diffuse boundaries. If you are unable to self-soothe, if you're unable to self-reassure, and therefore you seek it from other people, not good. Also, not good for anxiety if you engage in a lot of reassurance-seeking behaviors. What consequences can be the result of long-term diffuse boundaries? Truly, Thad, a loss of identity. You could become so absorbed into a system that you forget about your own autonomy. So the way that you could think about this is, I'm going to scroll up really quick. So the way that you could think about this is if it was in the form of a Venn diagram. Okay, so we have self, and then we have other. So healthy in terms of boundaries would be, other could also mean system, okay? That there's overlap. Okay? But we still maintain self and we still maintain other. So there are often clear boundaries that exist within this space. Now, what diffuse boundaries do, I'm going to stick with the color coding. What diffuse boundaries do is they basically move the circles in this direction so that all of a sudden, at its worst, you have self and other. So that this circle is so deeply intertwined, you wouldn't be able to say how you feel, what you think. You would constantly defer, or you'd become anxious at the idea that there's self. So if you find yourself feeling anxious when you are asked for something and you find yourself kind of getting anxious because you want to get confirmatory information from the system, there's a good chance that you've moved to a space of having a lot of diffuse boundaries. So this is what this looks like. Conversely, if you move in the direction of rigid, what happens is then you get self, other, and then there's chaos because you've basically put this really rigid boundary here. And this is where you could maybe get into a space of some narcissism. You can get into a space of being just so self-assured that you won't take influence from others or from the system. And that's generally not helpful either. Like, we need to be able to work and relate and build upon each other. So, take the stream, for example. Like, yes, I want to differentiate myself within the world of mental health streaming, but I also want to belong in that world at the same time. So I have to figure out what's me and then what's the group. How do I engage with the group, but how do I also maintain my independence, right? If I started changing the stream every day because I saw what other people were doing and I was like, oh my God, I need to do that, I need to do that, I need to do that, I have diffuse boundaries with the community. Conversely, if I was like, nope, doing my thing no matter what, screw all of you, you're doing it wrong, that's overly rigid, and neither one of those is going to be useful, right? So I have to find a balance. I'm thinking about this all the time with my stream, but I'm also thinking about it just in real life. We want to, as best we can, sit within a space of being able to move out in this direction when we need to, and move into this direction as best we can. Does that make sense? I hope this is helpful. Like, we learn our boundaries. What would a path to recover from identity loss look like? That's an awesome question, Thad. Okay, so I'm gonna keep with the Venn diagram for a second here. Let's talk about anxiety, because that's like my favorite thing in the world, and that's what I specialize in clinically. So can't not talk about anxiety when we have a DrMick stream, right? Let's talk about it. One of the things that we are going to be thinking about here, Thad and everybody else, is I talk about distress tolerance. I talk about distress tolerance a lot. Distress tolerance being, how long can you hang in there with discomfort? How long can you sit in that and then make a decision about how to interact and how to talk to yourself while uncomfortable? People have varying levels of distress tolerance. So, to answer your question, Thad, if you are a person who tends to set rigid boundaries, you are going to be more anxious when asked to think about others and the needs of others, the desires of others, what other people think, how other people feel, what they're asking of you. And you're going to need to build a level of distress tolerance in there. So you're going to experience anxiety when asked about that. And so if I'm working with a person who has a significant amount of rigid boundaries in their life, what we're doing is we're talking about, well, what do other people need from you? What does you integrated within a system look like? And what happens is people start to get anxious in that moment, and then the rigid person is going to do what? We talked about this, right? They're going to try to disengage. They're going to try and get out and put up walls. And they may even do that with me. They even say, like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't care. I don't give a shit about that stuff. Why do I got to talk about that stuff? They're threatened in some way because we're having to consider somebody else. We're having to consider giving up some of our protectors. So it's building distress tolerance around that, talking about it, and then saying, you know what? So in this instance, it sounds to me like your partner in this instance is wanting to go on a walk with you. And I would encourage you to talk about that and then either negotiate that a bit or figure out how to go on the walk, because that's what they need. It's a very simplistic example, but it's building that distress tolerance, okay? Conversely, with people who have diffuse boundaries, what we're doing is you're going to see that person experience an uptick in anxiety whenever you ask them about themselves. So, Thad, an example of this might be, let's say a person comes into my therapy office and they say, oh my God, so I was asked about how I feel about a project that I'm doing at work, and I don't know what to say. And I might say, okay, well, how do you feel about it? The person goes, I don't know how I feel. I mean, people at work seem to be really anxious about it. People at work seem to be really excited about it. So I guess I'm excited. Then what I'm going to do is build the distress tolerance around saying, you know what? I'm not worried about what the other people at work think. I know you are. I know that helps you make a decision, but I want you to think for a second. Check in with your body. If I say this project X, does something tighten up? How do you feel? So having to basically build a sense of self. What do you want? And if you're somebody who's deeply enmeshed, you're going to probably operate on the wants of the system. Here's another example. If you go around saying things like, I am not worthy of love, and I'm a piece of shit, and so I don't deserve to be in a relationship, I don't deserve to be loved by somebody, that is very likely the product of enmeshed boundaries. And what that suggests is that you're not fighting your battle. You're fighting the battle of your family system that told you that you're not lovable. So you are operating on behalf of the other because you have diffuse boundaries. And so I'm going to be saying things to you like, you matter, and we need to figure out what you want. You are deserving of this. Tell me what you deserve. Tell me what you want. And it's a process. You really have to build a relationship with a person before you're going to be able to get in there and challenge them on either of these. It's hard to sit in this middle space consistently. Like, we tend to kind of go back and forth. But what we're encouraging, and Victoria, this is for you because Bowen talked about this. What we're encouraging is what's called differentiation, which is where I can understand the values, needs, time constraints, emotional state, all of that of others and the system. And I can understand my needs, my values, my time, my emotions, autonomously and individual to that system. And now we have to figure out how to put them together. What is my overlap? And this changes per person. There's no hard and fast rule about this, but it gets dangerous if this circle starts to move too close in that direction. It also gets dangerous if this circle starts to move too far in that direction, because then you're either isolated or fully absorbed. And we don't want that really in any case, because as human beings, that's just not how we operate. It's not healthy. It's all about where you build your distress tolerance with anxiety. How do you learn what it is you want and are feeling, especially in a given moment? I honestly don't know pretty often. It's often checking in with your emotional experience, Jinx. Really seeing how your body feels when presented with certain information. And here's the other thing is our wants and desires often come out through our self-talk and through our behaviors and where we become tired. And so those three things I can assess from a person and then generally help scaffold their ability to define their own wants and needs and all of that stuff. None of this is a quick fix, guys. None of this is something that you're going to change overnight. But yes, it is possible. This is basically a glimpse into my mind when I'm doing therapy. So what do healthy boundaries look like? You may be asking yourself, great, okay, so you told us, Ryan, what not to do. Can you please tell us what to do? Can you please help us figure out what do healthy boundaries actually look like? So glad you asked. You can bring yourself to value your own opinions and difference from the system. So how I feel about something, where I stand on something, I value that and it matters to me, but I also realize that there are other perspectives that the system may not feel the same way, and I don't experience threat around that. I can appreciate that. I appreciate difference. So when I told you guys a while back about the assignment that I did in class about people talking about accurate representations, it was for us to have an appreciation as a group of difference. You have your, like, this is a thing. So chemotherapy, for example, you know, a lot of people go through chemotherapy, but no two people have this exact same experience of the chemotherapy. And so can we appreciate difference? Can we appreciate our opinions? Can we value our own opinions and the opinions of others, and then making an informed decision about how we want to operate? What boundaries do I want to set as a result? You heard it earlier when I said, you know, I really hated getting vaccinations, but I appreciate vaccinations. I am pro-vaccine, not in any way anti-vax. I think that's what I'm not even gonna go on that soapbox. But I do appreciate that there are people who are anti-vax, and it starts with being curious about that. Before I place a value judgment, I can place a value judgment on the concept and say the idea of anti-vax I just cannot get behind. At the same time, I can appreciate a person's experience of being anti-vax and be curious about it. So you also can hold your own values and the values of others. I know that's maybe a bit of an overlap, but a person with clear boundaries will not compromise their own values or forego their own values just willy-nilly. If you're going to change your opinion or alter the way that you're engaging, it's an intentional decision. This is so important. Person who appreciates context. A person who can navigate different spaces and adjust their boundaries as necessary relative to the situation or context that they are in. That is often a reflection of a person's ability to set clear boundaries and to be flexible. So I may need to share more personal information here. I may need to share less personal information over here. Based on the context I'm in, I'm going to be thinking about that and be very intentional. So I don't overshare. I also don't undershare. I can move through a space and know what I want to get out of that space and also know what that system wants to get out of me. I can balance the system and myself and appreciate the context of that. Heard a scientist go on record saying to be kind to flat earthers, do this, actually making them do some form of scientific research. Yes, Zach. It does not do you any good to polarize yourself against people that you disagree with, because all that does is make them polarize. It doesn't do you any good. People who have been successfully pulled out of like the KKK and stuff, it's because there was empathy there and people reached out, not empathy toward the viewpoint, certainly not condoning the behaviors, but appreciating that there's a human there that could be connected with, and connecting with those values, connecting with those boundaries, and saying like, I wonder why you have those. And that can really pull people toward the middle. Sage, thank you very much for the host. It's really good to have you in here. It's like they hate the sin, not the sinner. Correct. Hard to know what's oversharing or undersharing depending on context, isn't? Because different people have different opinions. That's exactly right. So that's why we do our research a bit, Gerbo. That's why if we're unsure, we might say to a person, hey, you know what? I'm having a hard time figuring out how much to disclose here. How are you feeling? Like if you're at a job interview, you might look at and talk to other people who have been in similar job interviews to ask them, like, what was the vibe? Like, how much should I be sharing about myself here? There are inherent rigid boundaries that are built into job interviews in the US. Like you can't ask about political affiliation or like even race, ethnicity, disability, any of that stuff. Like you can't ask about that in an interview. That's a rigid boundary that's been put in place to protect people. So again, it's just you have to be able to speak directly about it. And if you're confused and you're unsure, that's generally where you're going to learn about what kind of boundaries you set. Because if all of a sudden you're confused or you get anxious and then you start setting rigid boundaries and you go, you know what? Okay, fine. I'm just going to completely disengage. That tells you that you're a person who has a propensity to set rigid boundaries. If you're in that moment and you don't quite know what to say, and then you just go with what like you say like, all right, well, I'm just going to go off of whatever anybody else says. I'm not even going to think about my own values. Could be diffuse. Another example of healthy boundaries is you know what you need and want. You know your desires, or at the very least, you're thinking about them. It's not like you have to have them fully defined. And then you communicate directly. So hey, here's what I need. You know what? When I came home from work, I'm really tired. I'm really frustrated. I had a bad day. I really know that you want to hang out with me and that you want to spend some time together. But you know what? Like, I really need to just play video games for like 30 minutes and then we can talk and then I will be fully present with you. Can you work with me on that? That would be an example of having clear boundaries in a given moment around energy. Is there a such thing as being too direct? Not necessarily. No, I mean, you could be direct in a way that's like really terse and off-putting. But no, I generally think being able to state clearly where you're at with something or how you're feeling, like Like, this conversation's not going where, like, I don't feel comfortable where this conversation is going, so I'm gonna need to stop. I mean, you guys hear me set clear boundaries all the time. If you ever ask a question I can't answer, I will state to you, hey, I wish I could answer that, but I can't. And then I can give you a reason for why. That's the other thing, is people with clear boundaries often are able to explain why their boundaries are the way that they are. People with clear boundaries also have the ability to accept the boundaries of others, or at the very least be curious about them. And if a person sets a rigid boundary and says, hey, I don't want to talk about that right now, that they can say, okay. Or they might say, you know what? I really appreciate that you're saying you don't want to talk about that right now. At the same time, this is a really important thing for us to talk about. So if we can't talk about it now, we definitely need to talk about it later. That's flexibility, right? Not, well, okay, then we'll never talk about it. That's diffuse. See how that works? I'll ask him what's wrong and he'll tell me he can't talk about it. And I know that when he's ready to talk, he will. Cool. So if that's been negotiated, Rosalind, then that's awesome. So then you know how to operate. The boundaries are clear. They're flexible. Maybe there's a time where you really do need him to talk. Cool. The thing about all of these boundaries is that, and I'm going to write this in big, giant, bold letters. Because if there's really nothing else that you remember, it's that context matters. We got to be thinking about what context we're in, what relationship we're in, what situation we're in. That's where we have to negotiate our boundaries. Is it okay for me to be a little more rigid here? Is it okay for me to be a little more diffuse here? Is it okay? Like, should I stay clear? Right? Because flexibility means that you can kind of move in either direction without it going off the rails. Where, like, there's a threshold where you don't quite get to being overly rigid or overly diffuse in general. If I'm in a, I hate to use this example, but if I'm in a grocery store and somebody pulls out a gun, I'm going to be very rigid with my boundary and run away. So I'm not going to be like, well, maybe it's not that dangerous. I'm out. So it's okay to overstep others' boundaries for the sake of, say, a romantic relationship. Oh, no, not necessarily, Zach. No, I wouldn't say overstepping a person's boundary is cool. I would say that you should know what they are, and if you're feeling like you're starting to overstep a boundary, to communicate about it. Like, if a person is saying, like, say, for example, a person's just like latched onto you and won't give you space to go hang out with friends, and you say, hey, I really want to go out with my friends tonight. And it's not because I don't like you. It's not because I don't love you. It's not because I'm abandoning you. It's just because I want to go hang out with my friends. Like, that could be considered an overstepping of a boundary, of a diffuse boundary. And you may have to talk about it. Be like, look, this is something that's really important to me. And maybe that other person says, well, this is really important to me. You go, cool, let's negotiate it. Let's figure it out. Let's clarify them. Let's get them a little more flexible. Let's get in. Let's go. That's cool. Yes, negotiating boundaries is totally fine. That's a mark of clear and flexible boundaries, is I can negotiate them. I can look at them. I can look in a relational context and say, you know what? I have my boundaries. You have yours. We're going to have to figure out how to sync these up. Good relationships often happen. Intimate relationships happen because people sync up their boundaries into clarified boundaries. When I work with polyamorous, open and non-monogamous couples, one of the most important parts of working with polyamory is that boundaries are very clear. Not very rigid, but very clear. You have to talk about things that you may not otherwise talk about. It's the same thing with monogamous relationships too. It's amazing how many things go unstated in relationships. How many boundaries we have that we don't talk about. A common example being sex. Like, in monogamous relationships, it is not super common for monogamous relationships to say explicitly, do not have sex with other people. Or the way that infidelity is structured, people often have some sense of it, but they don't communicate it until the boundary is violated. And as a therapist, I'm all about like, yo, we got to get this shit out on the table. I have to be able to exercise with you yourself what you need, what you want, and the other. I have to figure out what both of you want so that we can move to a space where we have this healthy overlap. Or in the case of like 3 people where we have this healthy overlap, or 4 or whatever. So that's what we're working towards. So I'm going to show you guys really quick something that can happen in, say, a parent-child dyad. So let's say we have P1 and P2. So let's say that we have these 2 parents who tend to set up really rigid boundaries, particularly when they fight. They disengage. And so they put these big walls up with each other. And we might say that they have like a very rigid boundary between the 2 of them. That's actually the way that I'm going to do it. They tend to put up very rigid boundaries. They disengage, they don't talk. And let's say that these parents have 2 kids. They've got K1, K2. Now let's say that parent 1 has, when they disengage, they become also very rigid with the children. K2, or in parent 2, has a very diffuse relationship with the kids. When you introduce anxiety into this system and there's these rigid boundaries, what you're going to see is this parent is going to kind of go away, and then this parent is going to overlap with these kids. And what you might see is this parent doesn't talk to anybody about what's going on or goes external of the relationship, and then parent 2 goes and talks to their kid inappropriately about what's happening in the parent dynamic as a way of reassurance seeking from the children, that like, I get my love for my children, so that further rigidifies my boundary with the parent. This is a sequence that I see happen all the time. All the time. Yeah, see, like people are already saying this speaks to my experience. I see this all the time. And so then what you have is this with P1 over here, where this shrinks into itself and this person becomes even more distant, which then creates a rigid boundary between parent and that system. And so then what happens, and the way that this presents in therapy is, let's say kid number 1 has an uptick in anxiety. That is also going to cause an uptick in anxiety for parent 1, uptick in anxiety for parent 2. What's parent 1 going to do? Rather than having a nice, clear relationship with P1, parent 1 is going to seek reassurance from the kids, and this becomes a horrific spiral where parent 2's emotional state is completely tied up in their children's emotional state. In which case that parent then becomes overbearing and over-involved, and then loses their sense of self into their parenting identity, whereas this person then loses their parenting identity potentially as an outsider, or just completely disappears from the picture. So this is the way in a family system that these boundaries can show up in a way that causes problems. So finally, the last part I'm going to do before we just kind of chat and wrap up and ask and answer questions and stuff is thinking about the actual process of setting boundaries. So like, what does this actually look like? If you want to start setting some clear boundaries with people and you want to start to have some healthier boundaries, what you want to consider is the following. 1, is define your boundary. So in a given context, and again, we're going to be taking into account context for all of this. Define your boundary. What is it? Is it a boundary for yourself? Is it a boundary for somebody else? Is it a boundary for your time? Is it a boundary for your emotional energy? What is it? What does it actually look like? Does it mean that you need to go, does it mean you need to go a little more diffuse? Does it mean you need to go a little more rigid? Does it mean you need to state it? What does it look like? Does it mean I'm going to say, you know what, tonight, because I want to just take care of myself, I'm going to order takeout. I'm not going to cook dinner because that's going to put me over the edge. All right. So what is it? How does it get operationalized? What does it actually look like? Then, and this is a part that people do not think about as often as they should. What is the consequence if that boundary is violated? So if I say, for example, tonight, let's say a parent's being a complete asshole, and you set a boundary that says, you know what, I need an apology before I'm going to be willing to spend time with you or continue being in a relationship with you. Like, let's say just anybody like grossly violates something and you need an apology. So I need an apology from you. So what's your boundary? I need an apology. What does it actually look like? I need you to say that you're sorry to me, and I need you to acknowledge the ways in which you hurt me. What is the consequence if that boundary is violated? So if the person won't apologize, if the person says, nope, screw you, Dr. Mick, I'm not going to apologize, what's the consequence? In this case, the consequence, I suppose, for me would be I'm not going to continue this relationship. And you had damn well better be ready for point number 5. Get to that in a minute. State the boundary clear and directly. Passively, don't show it. Don't just be like, okay, well, I'm gonna just ghost you. Ghosting, by the way, is really shitty because it's not a clear and direct communication of a boundary. You might think it is, but it's not. Okay. So state it clearly and directly. I no longer want, like, hey, first date, I wasn't feeling it. I don't really want to continue it, but I appreciate you. I hope you have a good life. It's way better than ghosting people. All right, so state it clearly and directly. If the person adheres to your boundary, reward it. However, if the boundary is violated, be ready to follow through with the consequence. If the consequence is just, I'm going to have to think about how I reshape my boundaries with the person and whatever, that's fine. But if you have defined what the consequence is, if this boundary is validated, you had damn well better be ready to follow through with it. If you don't follow through with it, you are skewing right here. That is a representation of a diffuse boundary because you are not following through on your value, on your energy, on your time. So this is why I say you can't not have boundaries. If you do not follow through on the consequences of your boundaries, you are facilitating diffuse boundaries with the person that you are setting the boundary with. You are effectively reinforcing for that person that they can violate your boundaries. So people don't think about that though. They really don't. Or when push comes to shove, their anxiety goes up. And the thing is, here's what you have to realize. You have to ask yourself as a person, what do you do when your anxiety goes up? Do you rigidify your boundaries or do you become more diffuse? Because this process creates anxiety. Setting boundaries is hard. You are absolutely right, Rosalind. It is not easy to set boundaries with people. Evaluating the consequences can go up here, but you may also have to do it on the fly. Okay, so it can go in either or both of these spots, just to be clear. You have to be able to anticipate that. Important thing to remember about that, Zach, is that adults can anticipate consequences. Children cannot. So you have to explain to children consequences. Children do not think abstractly enough to be able to consider what the consequence of a given action is beyond maybe like what's immediately in front of them or what's immediately reinforced. We as adults have to evaluate what is the potential consequence. If I harden up my boundary here, if I state this clear boundary, is it a repercussion that I can tolerate? And this is why I say, Zach, sometimes we have to have diffuse boundaries. Sometimes you have to be a part of a system that you may or may not disagree with because you need a job, because you may be looking for other employment, but you got to put up with some bullshit while you're in the process of doing that. Like, that's part of it. And that's why I say power is a part of this. Sometimes we just don't have the power to set the clear boundaries that we want. But if we don't have the power to set the clear boundaries that we want with the other person or the system, we had damn well at least better be thinking about what our boundaries are with ourselves when we have time to ourselves and we are not in that system, if that makes sense. I think that's an important piece of this too. So you have to be aware of what the repercussions are, and does it rub against the value boundary that you have? Like I said, in the example I gave earlier, if I was asked to just say screw it to grades and give everybody in my class an A regardless of effort, I wouldn't teach in the program. But I also I'm privileged at this point to be able to say, like, no, I have other things that I can do and I'm not going to teach. If I was in a system where like I had no other options, I may have to get diffuse with my boundaries there at the expense of my values, and that would really suck. So it's a privilege to be able to set clear boundaries, and I think that's an important thing to be acknowledged. At the same time, we at the very least can do our best to set boundaries with ourselves and know what we expect of ourselves. Because the other thing, the final point that I want to make before we start chatting, is boundaries. This is where it all comes together, okay? With everything I've ever talked about. Our boundaries are our expectations. And when our expectations are created in such a way that our experiences can align with them, as human beings, we will feel more comfortable. If you are setting boundaries that are creating expectations that your experiences continue to violate or be violated by, you are going to live your life very anxiously. And so this is why it's so important for us to think about our boundaries and to think about what's healthy for us. Because then we have these very clear expectations and we can fit our experiences within them. We can change the expectations if we need to. We can change the boundaries if we need to. But if you start to become overly rigid, your experiences are going to cause anxiety, because rigid boundaries inherently can only box so much in. Diffuse boundaries can only let so much out. What's up, Professor Melko? It's good to see you. So this is why all of this is so damn important. Why we talk about it and why it's always on my mind as a therapist. So that's it. That's what I got for you. Hope you enjoyed it. It was fun.